Hey, welcome back to the Stash. There was a moment in time when Marvel truly intended to end Spider-Man's story, to put to rest their most iconic hero, not with death nor tragedy, but with peace. It's a feeling that's quite rare for our webhead, one that's honestly deserving after all he's endured. Now, before the Clone Saga fully collapsed under its own weight and Ben Reilly became the one and only Spider-Man for New York City, Marvel gave Peter Parker a proper farewell. A quiet and deeply emotional farewell. It was called Spider-Man: The Final Adventure. Released between the end of 1995 and the beginning of 1996, the story was put together thanks to writer Fabian Nicieza and artist Derek Robertson. This 4-issue miniseries was meant to serve as Peter Parker's last outing as the Amazing Spider-Man, his one big curtain call to allow him a genuine happy ending with the love of his life. But sadly, I feel as time forgot it. And honestly, I don't blame it for being forgotten one bit. Since its release, it's now been buried by controversy, retcons, and overall fatigue of the current states of within ASM. Because of all of this, the final adventure wasn't so final after all, and so naturally, it faded into obscurity. Today though, I want to bring it back, because the final adventure is honestly a favorite of mine from the Clone Saga and a comic I think deserves more recognition. It's one of the most intimate Spider-Man stories ever told. I think there's something really special about that. It's a story about loss, acceptance, and what it means to be human when the powers you've had for the majority of your life might slip away forever. So this is Spider-Man: The Final Adventure, the forgotten ending of Peter Parker. But hey, real quick, here at The Stash, we're swinging for 19,000 subscribers by the end of the month. Now that's a tall order, I know, but with great power comes great responsibility, and all you gotta do is click subscribe. So if you're into Spider-Man or just comic book deep dives like this, feel free to stick around. But anyway, with all that being said, let's get right back into the video. Now honestly, just like with anything from the Clone Saga era, there's a lot of baggage to it. By the mid-90s, Marvel was stuck in an era where they were just chasing lightning and losing itself in the storm, so to speak. The Clone Saga had properly taken over Spider-Man comics, and there wasn't a title for the Wallcrawler left out for its overarching plot. And what started as a small arc had ballooned into a years-long labyrinth of identity crises, imposters, and corporate meddling. Readers were rightfully frustrated, sales were slipping, and Marvel needed something radical to fix it. And so their solution at the time was to retire Peter Parker, to give Ben Reilly the keys to the Amazing Spider-Man title, and to give the original, who was then believed to have been the clone, a chance to finally rest. At that point in continuity, Peter and Mary Jane were married and expecting their first child. They had been through death, resurrection, and trauma, and after years of sacrifice, the ending kinda made sense. Ben Reilly would become the new Spider-Man since he was younger, fresher, and technically the original, while Peter would step away and finally start a new life. That's where the final adventure begins. A story not about who Spider-Man is, but who Peter Parker becomes when he must leave behind the mask. Fabian Nicieza described it as a story about transition and identity, and I think he nailed that approach. I mean, the story really got it right, especially with how they depict Peter, a man who spent his life running towards danger, finally realizing it's okay to stop, and that's exactly what makes it so powerful. Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson have left New York behind. Things have changed, and with said change, they now find themselves trying to build a quiet life in Portland. Peter's got a new job, they've both got a new home, and even a baby on the way. Peter's working at Garrett Labs, a genetic research company studying the same kind of radiation that once changed his life. And hopefully by working there, he can find out about anything he needs to know regarding his unborn child. But peace never lasts for long for someone like Peter Parker. Inside the facility, he feels something's wrong. His spider sense tingles. It's that same feeling that saved his life 100 times before, reminding him that he can never really escape what he is. Within the lab though, there's tensions brewing between scientist Monica Staphos and Erica Swinner over a dangerous experiment called the Synthetic Skin Project. At home, however, Mary Jane is anxious. She's worried about the future, about raising a child, and about Peter's inability to let go. And even amidst Peter's reassurance, he still finds himself later that night staring at the old Spider-Man suit, the one he swore he'd never wear again. Meanwhile, back in New York, Ken Ellis starts digging into Peter's past, chasing a story the world doesn't need to hear. He feels that there's a bigger connection towards Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and there's very few things that will stop him from finding out the truth. The tension at Garrett, however, reaches an all-time high. Unbeknown to Monica exactly what Peter did to her formula in secret, she deems it ready for testing, and so one of their main test subjects, River Varys, is in for the transformation of his life. Immediately, he begins to mutate from the tampered formula. He turns into something horrifying and doesn't hold back one bit. Monica, before meeting her grimly fate though, managed to call Peter, begging for his help, and without hesitation, he leaps out of bed, ready to save the day like he used to oh so many times before. MJ is having none of it, but Peter is certain on what he must do, for he might have moved across the country, but destiny still knows his name. In Portland, a man stumbles home after a night out, but he never makes it. Instead, he's snatched from the shadows by the thing that was once called River Varys. He's no longer that same man though. He's now twisted by a failed synthetic skin experiment fused with Peter's irritated blood. He's now a monster named Tendril. This is the third victim known. The city sees a monster, but Garrett sees a crisis. Inside their boardroom, Bill Gallanan, Eric Schwinner, Calvin Falconer, and Peter Parker converse. Falconer suggests they capture Tendril themselves as a way to contain the fallout and protect Garrett's image. Peter, though, is pressed to explain what he's found about Monica's secret work, however he claims ignorance. But secretly, he's discovered some of the inner workings of the formula, and it can lead directly to the mutation that's altered his life in ways no one could have ever imagined. That night, Peter suits up as Spider-Man. He breaks his promise yet again to MJ, and so she rightfully confronts him. Peter argues he's doing it to protect their future, even going so far as to bring up the uncertainty of their child's health given his radioactivity. He needs the chance to understand it. They continue their fight. The atmosphere is suffocating, but then through it all, Peter manages to leave Mary Jane with words to think about as he leaps off into the night sky, chasing Tendril and answers yet unknown. As the silence fills the room, it's cut off by the sound of the phone ringing. It's Ken Ellis, the Daily Bugle reporter, asking questions about Peter's trial, Scarlet Spider, and Peter's secret connections. And even though Mary Jane ends the call abruptly, Ken Ellis is still hot on the trail. Later on, Peter actually encounters the thing now known as Tendril. It's been a while since he had to do something like this, and the rush shows, and it doesn't really help when you're fighting something that you can't really get a hold of. So as expected, Tendril gets away, and as Peter's marriage is further tested, he has to go back to work. But once he returns home, it's not his wife he'll be greeted by, but instead, a certain goodbye letter. Spider-Man spends the night chasing Tendril, driven by guilt, fear, and the flickers of his spider sense. As dawn breaks, exhaustion grips him, and the weight of Mary Jane's silence hits him hard. He remembers the note she left, the note he crumbled in anger. He couldn't even finish it. Then, after checking his answering machine, he realizes that he's late for an appointment with Calvin Falconer. The plan was to visit Paul Contoni, a man whose diseased skin holds clues to Tendril's condition. Meanwhile though, Tendril visits his mother's grave. Once River Varys, now a monster born of mutation, he reflects on his past, abandonment, addiction in his father, and a childhood of pain. He embraces the bitterness he carries. So as he leaves, he steps fully into vengeance. Back in Portland, Peter and Calvin arrive at Contoni's house. Contoni, broken and suffering, tells them to leave him be. He's had enough of pain and enough of intrusion, but all this does is make Falconer want to storm in and use force. Luckily, Peter stops and reminds him that this man has suffered enough. Whether he cooperates or not, he deserves his own privacy and respect. Then afterwards, Peter goes back as Spider-Man to pay Contoni a visit. The man's hurting. He's lost everything, but luckily for him, Peter offers Paul a way out. Meanwhile, in New York City, Mary Jane stays at Aunt May's home, restless and worried. She's had some model shoots, but even there she couldn't focus. So now she tries to call Peter, but he hasn't picked up once, leaving her with nothing else to do but overthink. Ken Ellis, however, is still digging and tries to find out any new information or a clue for his story. And after bumping into Mary Jane at the Bugle, he gets an idea. Later that night, Mary Jane receives a visit from Ben Reilly, who by now has fully embraced being Spider-Man. But their visit is interrupted when Ken Ellis knocks on the front door with a news headline in hand. One that exposes Peter Parker as the Amazing Spider-Man. Ken Ellis threatens to publish the story unless Mary Jane talks, but she's had enough. She calls his bluff, gives Ken a stern lecture, and then slams the door in his face. When she turns around, Ben Reilly drops down from the ceiling. He'd been hiding there the whole time, hoping Ken didn't see him. They both know Ellis won't stop, but Ben's grin says he has an idea. Across the country in Portland, Peter Parker has no idea what's happening in Queens, but he's suited up again, hunting a killer just like the old days. Tendril has now become more dangerous than ever before. Peter's body though is breaking down too. The same necrotizing infection that created Tendril is now potentially killing him as well. He knows that curing Tendril might not only kill him too, but if altered just right, also make him lose his radioactivity. It would mean the end of his powers, his strength, the last trace of his being Spider-Man. So he tracks Tendril to the Governor Hotel, interrupting him mid-kill. Peter saves the victim, but loses the killer as he's forced to stay behind and free the hostages while the police comes in. Back in Manhattan, Mary Jane storms in the Bugle to confront Robbie Robertson as she's furious that Ellis is harassing her and Peter for a story that should have died years ago. Then the next morning, Ben visits J. Jonah Jameson as Spider-Man, webbing him to his chair and mocking the Bugle's front page. It's petty and reckless, but it works. After the prank, Joe Robertson convinces Jonah to kill the story about Peter Parker once and for all. Ellis, however, doesn't back down easily. He threatens to take it to the Daily Globe, but Robertson calls in all his favors from editors to contacts alike until Ellis finally gives up. The story dies quietly and Mary Jane, for the first time in weeks, breathes again. Back in Portland, Spider-Man picks up Tendril's signal again, leading him back to the hotel rooftop. There, Dry Rot also appears, desperate for the same cure that could restore them both. Then as Tendril and Dry Rot fight, Peter races to finish building something to allow their plan to continue. It's a machine that can temporarily deactivate Dry Rot and Tendril's powers, so he sneaks in close and fires. A burst of energy explodes across the rooftop, but thankfully, it worked. Tendril and Dry Rot are human again. For now at least. Later on, Peter Parker helps supervise the final experiment at Garrett. Tendril and Dry Rot are stabilized, but the machine begins to overload as Tendril eventually fights back. The thing is though, it can still work, but Peter has to be the one to make it work. So he steps into the chamber and holds the machine in place, the one that gave him his powers all those years ago. The pain is unbearable, searing through his veins just like that day the spider bit him, and when it's over, Dry Rot is human again. But Tendril suffered a fate far worse for his refusal to accept the cure. Peter is cured too, but so are his powers. No more wall crawling, no more web slinging, no more Spider-Man. He returns home to pack away the costume and ready to say goodbye to that part of his life. But when Mary Jane walks through the door, he freezes. He thought she left him for good. She shows him the note he never finished reading. It only said she was in New York for a photo shoot. She was always coming back. And so the two share a beautiful moment as they hold each other tightly. With his powers gone, Peter throws himself into living. He volunteers at a homeless shelter, and in general, he helps people the way he always has, just without the mask. Because he's still Spider-Man in spirit, if not in name. With great power comes great responsibility. Now Peter's learning what that means all over again. As a husband, as a soon-to-be father, and as a man finally free to rediscover who he is. At its heart, Spider-Man: The Final Adventure isn't about science or monsters, but rather it's about morality, about realizing that no matter how much strength you've had, no matter how many times you've saved the world, there comes a day where you have to stop. Most superhero stories celebrate gaining power, whereas this one asks what happens when you give it up. Peter has to give them up. It's his responsibility in that moment. He knows the cost before he steps into that area, and he holds the machine steady anyway. So, yes, he lost his powers, but he lost them doing what he's always done best. Saving others. It's strength in his purest form. Because for Peter Parker, being Spider-Man was always about what he did with his powers, and so the brilliance of the writing here is that it finds the perfect balance between drama and quietness within the choice to get rid of the powers. And I love the way they have Peter uphold the line bestowed upon him by his late Uncle Ben, to use his great power for his great responsibility, because that's who he is. The man who will always do what's right, even when it means giving up the very thing that once defined him. And that's the paradox at the heart of the final adventure. Peter Parker's greatest act of heroism comes not from his power, but from his willingness to let it go. Now I've used the "with great power comes great responsibility" line already a few times in this video, but that's because I believe that this story is one of the few where the motto is deeply engraved within each moment spent with Peter Parker. Not to mention how it's also the foundation of Spider-Man's entire mythology, but the thing I love is how the final adventure turns that idea upside down, because by the end of it, the power's gone. So what does Peter's responsibility mean now? Well, now, seen as it's not about punching villains or saving cities, it's about knowing when to let go, about making peace with your choices, about moving forward with your wife and your unborn child. Peter's greatest act of heroism is simply walking away from the mask, because he finally understood that responsibility also means taking care of himself and his family. This to me is maturity and growth, and a proper display of the greatest strength Peter Parker ever showed was knowing when to stop being Spider-Man. Now, Mary Jane is the emotional center of this story. She's not just the worried wife, she's the mirror to Peter's soul. For her fear isn't selfish, it's love. She's literally seen him go through hell on so many occasions, and now as they expect a child, her pleas feel heavier. But what makes their relationship work here is honesty. And I think a lot of that comes down to how being Spider-Man within the story is at times like an addiction for Peter. Because of that, there's this deep, real personal conflict shown with every confrontation, and that to me is what makes this version of Peter and MJ so compelling. They're actually grown-ups. They're actually trying to live real lives, and in that sense, it now feels like a farewell to an era. An era when Peter Parker and Mary Jane could still dream of a life beyond the mask. Ben Reilly rarely appears in this story, but his shadow definitely looms large, and I do really love the couple of scenes that he's actually in. By 1995, Ben had taken over as Spider-Man in the main titles, and he was meant to represent the new era of comics, and meanwhile the final adventure represents acceptance, closure, and maturity. Here, Peter and Ben aren't rivals, and I always appreciate stories that have them on good terms. And even though they don't interact within the story, they're more so reflections of each other. Two halves of the same identity, one learning to begin and the other learning to end. In a way, the final adventure makes peace with the idea that Spider-Man is bigger than one person, that the mask can live on even if the man behind it moves forward. Now, I think it's no secret that Marvel loves using science, especially the classic Silver Age comics by Stan Lee, Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby, be it from radioactive spiders, genetic mutations, all the way to cosmic rays, but the writer here treats science as moral weight. Garrett's experiments are well-intentioned but reckless. Tendril and Dryrod are necessarily evil as they're victims of ambition. They remind us that progress without empathy leads to destruction, and Peter the scientist is caught in the middle, the one man who understands both sides. That duality, man of science, man of conscience, is what defines him here. It's a war between reason and emotion, and it ends not with a battle, but with understanding. Now, Derek Robertson's artwork gives the final adventure its texture. Unlike the hyper-stylized look of the 90s, this book feels grounded and very much in line with designs we're all familiar with. His Peter looks like an older version of the Ditko Spider-Man. His MJ looks tired and properly human. But the thing I love the most about his artwork is how the book shines with every expression created by his hand. It all feels lived in. And when the final adventure ended, it was meant to be Peter Parker's goodbye. Ben Reilly had fully taken over as Spider-Man, Peter and MJ were retired, expecting a child and finally happy. But it didn't take long for Marvel to reverse their course. The Clone Saga collapsed, editorial changes swept through, Peter was back in costume, Ben was killed off, and the final adventure, this small, personal, beautiful story, was erased from relevance. It became a footnote, a what if. But going back to it now, decades later, it feels like something more. It's a glimpse into what could have been. A Spider-Man who grows old gracefully, who finds peace instead of tragedy, who learns that endings aren't failures, they're just the next step. It was a proper ending for Spider-Man for the 616. It wasn't some sort of, multiverse story like the MC2 one. This was meant to be it for the main Peter Parker. In a way, the final adventure predicted something modern comics still struggle with. How to let heroes evolve and how to let them change. Because no matter how many times the world reboots, Peter Parker remains stuck in that endless cycle of guilt and being down on his luck. But for 4 issues, he escaped it. For 4 issues, Spider-Man finally got to rest. When I finished reading the final adventure for a second time, I felt something I hadn't felt from a Spider-Man story in a long time. Even though I knew that this wasn't going to stick, I still got this profound sense of closure, that special kind that comes from understanding. For this story is all about the man, a man who's given everything and lost everything and still chooses to do the right thing one last time, and when the mask finally comes off, you realize something. Peter Parker was never great because he had power. He was great because he kept going even when it left him. That's why the final adventure deserves to be remembered, because it captures something rare. A superhero story brave enough to end quietly with so much respect for their greatest hero. This was a moment when Marvel said goodbye, and for a brief, beautiful time, Spider-Man got to be happy.